In this video, I want to provide an overview of the process of muscle contraction. We're going to be focusing on skeletal muscles for this video, though the process is similar in the other muscles, in the other two types of muscles in your body. Remember that any muscle in your body, such as the ones here in the lower forearm, are actually organs because they contain a combination of different tissues, not only muscle tissue, but also connective tissue and blood vessels and nerves. If we did a cross-section of one of these muscles, you can see that the skeletal muscle is actually made up of bundles that are all tied together with connective tissue. There are connective tissue at several layers. The most outermost layer is your epimysium. And then within each one of these bundles in the middle, if we do a close-up of that, those are called a fascicle. So if we take a close-up of the fascicle here, you can see inside the fascicle, we have the muscle fibers or the muscle cells themselves. So fascicle is a bundle of muscle cells, again, tied together with connective tissue. In this case, since we are inside the muscle, we're working with one of these fascicles inside there, it's perimysium, not epi. And then around each of the muscle fibers itself, we have endomysium, so connective tissue everywhere. Then if we go close up into one of those bundles that make up our fascicle, you see that we have the muscle fiber itself, the muscle cell, and inside of it there are these little red dots that represent all the myofibrils, the various bundles of the contractile protein itself. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be down in those myofibrils. So just as a review, skeletal muscle fiber, which is what we call a muscle cell, is a single cell that can contract in response to a neural stimulation, and then it relaxes when that stimulation ends. Muscle cells are shaped like thin cylinders, and they may be as long as the muscle itself, so they can be quite long, many, many centimeters. Muscle cells have some unique words for their parts. The cell membrane is called the sarcolemma, and the cytoplasm is the sarcoplasm. And in any individual muscle fiber, you often have many nuclei. It's a multinucleated cell, and of course, many, many mitochondria to provide the energy needed for contraction. Within that muscle fiber, we have these myofibrils, which are like little threads that lie parallel to each other within that fiber. And then around each myofibril, we have the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is the word for the endoplasmic reticulum when you're talking about muscle cells. So here's an illustration that is showing all of that. Here's your myofibril that has these long strands of protein that we'll be looking at in a minute. Many mitochondria in this muscle fiber. Here's one of probably several nuclei. Here's another one up here on the left. The sarcolemma, that cell membrane around it. The sarcoplasmic reticulum going in and out around all of those myofibrils. Each myofibril contains two different myofilaments. Those are contractile proteins called actin and myosin, and they are arranged in a particular repeating pattern called a sarcomere. The actin is actually a thin protein, and myosin is a thicker protein, and so they form the striations or stripes that we see in skeletal muscle, where if you're looking at it, there's a light band and a dark band, so they're kind of striped this way. When a muscle contracts, multiple sarcomeres in that myofibril will shorten. And so we can see here, this would be a relaxed sarcomere, and that would be its distance. And then here we have a contracted sarcomere. It has become much smaller. When that's happening throughout the muscle cell, throughout the muscle itself, then the whole muscle becomes smaller as it contracts, and the ends are pulled towards the center. This is all controlled by the connection between the muscle and the nervous system, which is known as the neuromuscular junction. So muscle contractions are started, they're initiated by a nerve impulse coming to them, because every muscle fiber has a direct connection to the axon, the end of a motor neuron. Each muscle fiber has one place that's known as the motor end plate, where there's a touch from a motor neuron. So a motor neuron, as we can see in this illustration, the motor neuron will split at the end, the axon, the nerve impulse comes down the axon, and there are multiple branches at the end. And so each branch is touching one muscle cell, so that one nerve may control any number of muscle cells. For some muscles, you have only a few nerves there because one muscle controls thousands of muscle fibers, or in places like your hands that are very capable of fine motor movements, you will have many nerves because each nerve only has a few fibers that it controls. The start of the muscle contraction process depends on the release of a neurotransmitter, a chemical, to move from the end of the nerve to the muscle. This is the chemical acetylcholine, and that's what really starts everything going after the nerve signal has passed down into the muscle fiber. Here's a close-up of this connection at the motor end plate. So we have the motor end plate showing here at the top. Notice that there is a space between the edge of the nerve and the muscle cell. This is known as the synapse, so your nerves do not touch directly. Electrical impulse comes down the nerve cell. It turns into a chemical impulse by the release of a chemical neurotransmitter, and then that chemical floats over and is picked up by the cell membrane on the other side. In this case, it's being picked up by a muscle fiber, and then that will trigger a bunch of responses inside that cell. The steps of muscle contraction then starts with the electrical nerve impulse reaching the axon terminal, releasing the acetylcholine neurotransmitter, which then floats over and binds to receptors on the sarcolemma, or the cell membrane of that muscle fiber. When enough receptors have received acetylcholine, we reach a point which is known as the threshold stimulus. So we need to have a certain amount of impulse coming through in order for your muscle to respond. And when that threshold stimulus is reached, then an electrical impulse actually travels through the muscle, and it reaches into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, the muscle version of the endoplasmic reticulum, where calcium ions are being stored. That electrical impulse causes a release of calcium ions from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. They go on to bind with the myofilaments we mentioned, the actin and myosin, in a way that opens up binding sites on actin filaments. And when those binding sites are exposed, then myosin can reach up and form what is known as cross bridges with the actin filaments and pull the end of the sarcomere closer together for a contraction. I have an illustration of this on the next page to hopefully help you see it a little better in your mind. The contraction will continue as long as acetylcholine is being released. We call this whole process the sliding filament theory because the actin and myosin filaments basically slide over each other to shorten the sarcomere, but they don't change anything in length. So here is our first step at the top, where cross bridges can form between the myosin, this thick fiber on the bottom, and the actin that we see on the top. Myosin has these little heads that stick up that will bind with actin once actin's binding sites have been exposed by the addition of calcium ions. And once they have connected, the myosin moves towards, in this case, towards the left. It's known as the power stroke. And the power stroke pulls basically these two fibers past each other. ATP is needed to get the myosin ready to go in this process, and it's also needed to release it at the end. So we see some places where ATP is involved in this process, leaving the myosin ready to connect to another actin binding site on an actin molecule. Here's another diagram that tries to show you how things are arranged inside the sarcomere, so that we see there are some attachment points at either end. This is known as the Z disc, and from those Z discs we have these thin actin fibers that come out. And then suspended from the center point, we have these thicker myosin fibers that reach out. And they overlap a tiny bit, and you can see the parts sticking out on the myosin representing the myosin heads. So your connection will happen between the myosin heads and the actin filaments at these points where they are in close proximity. And the myosin power stroke will move in the direction towards the center to pull the myosin towards the Z line on the right and on the left, so that when a contraction happens, you can see the whole thing has shortened because now there's this large amount of overlap between the actin and the myosin fibers. So, as already mentioned, ATP is needed for muscle contraction and relaxation because it is needed to help the myosin heads uncouple from the actin fibers. There is a small amount of ATP stored in muscle cells, so it'll always be there to be involved in muscle contraction. But ATP also, when it breaks down, it turns into ADP and a P and a inorganic phosphorus that can be recharged into ATP. So the first way it is recharged is by borrowing some energy from another molecule that has a high energy phosphate bond, creatine phosphate. This creatine phosphate cannot be used like ATP, but it can give energy to ADP and have it transformed into ATP. So it can recharge the discharged battery that ATP is. But most of the ATP for muscle contraction is coming from cellular respiration, using glycogen that's been stored in muscle and in the liver. Anaerobic respiration is what your body will use first for high-intensity movement or the quick burst of movements, things that happen in less than 2 minutes. And then aerobic respiration, involving oxygen, will take over when you're doing something that is low intensity and goes on for much longer than 2 minutes. During ATP production, and as it is being broken down, so cellular respiration produces it and ATP breaks it down, you also get large amounts of heat being released because energy is being transformed from one molecule to another, or the chemical energy is being moved from one molecule to another, and so heat is always a byproduct. So these are basically three pathways that energy is drawn on to make the ATP, which is actually the molecule involved in muscle contraction. The creatine phosphate pathway, the anaerobic respiration pathway, and the aerobic respiration pathway. And in any burst of exercise or muscle contraction activity, you may draw from all three of these pathways or possibly only one if it's a very, very short duration. This is just giving an illustration of that. The whole point is to make ATP from a disconnected ADP and P. Remember, the T stands for triphosphate and the D is diphosphate. So here's that extra phosphate that got kicked off as energy was released. Because in this breakdown, this is where energy comes out as ATP is broken apart. So our creatine phosphate can give us some energy to make ATP from ADP and P, and so can your anaerobic respiration, which results in a buildup of lactate, or of course, aerobic respiration, which is going to cause a release of carbon dioxide. After you are done exercising, you have what is known as post-exercise oxygen consumption. Since most of the time we are depending pretty much on the anaerobic exercise process for the kind of everyday powering of our muscles, if that's happening for a significant period of time, you can have a buildup of lactic acid in the muscles. And lactic acid has to be recycled back to a chemical known as pyruvate, or even take it one step further and turn it back into glucose to be stored in the liver as glycogen. And in order to do that recycling to get rid of that lactic acid, you need oxygen. And so it creates an oxygen debt. Your body is in debt for how much oxygen it needs. So even after the exercise ends, you find that you still are breathing more heavily so that you need more oxygen. And overall, even when your breathing seems to be normal, you are pulling a little more oxygen out of the air in your lungs than you normally do, because it can take several hours to repay that oxygen debt. Depending upon what kind of activity you engage in regularly, you can actually train your muscles and change their capacity to make them better able to do anaerobic respiration or better able to do aerobic respiration. So your body, as we've said several times, is constantly remodeling, constantly responding to the stresses you put on it. And one of the things that happens down in the cellular level is our body can actually be adapted to be better at anaerobic or aerobic respiration if we constantly challenge it in that way. Lastly, I just want to mention muscle fatigue. Muscle fatigue occurs when a muscle is suddenly unable to contract. And this can be due to just a lack of energy if you have not had enough sufficient stores of glucose or glycogen in your body. You can run out of that energy source and have muscle fatigue occur, but more likely you would experience because it is due to a buildup of waste products that interfere with the transmission of the impulse through the muscle, or perhaps the amount of sensitivity that the various filaments have to the chemical signals that are coming in the muscle. Or if you're a very new exerciser at any particular activity, you can actually have neural fatigue causing muscle fatigue, that your nerve cells are just not up to whatever stress you're putting on them. So muscle fatigue is something that you recover from fairly quickly. Because if it's an electrolyte problem, a waste product problem like the second one suggests, just kind of waiting a few minutes gives your body time to readjust the chemicals, and then you can find you could do another exercise requiring that muscle contraction. But it also can be, in the long term, it can be, again, one of the ways that it can stimulate your body to increase the amount of myofibrils that are built inside muscle cells. And this allows muscles to become larger. So we don't add, when you grow muscle, if you're doing some kind of exercise or strength training, you're trying to build your muscle, you're not necessarily adding more muscle cells to your body, but you can increase how many muscle myofibrils are present in any one cell. So your body will make more myofibrils, more protein, will put more protein into individual cells so that you are able to contract with greater strength. Cramps can sometimes occur with muscle contraction, and the current thought is that they occur when somehow the chemical balance in the extracellular fluid becomes one that causes an uncontrolled stimulation or contraction of the muscle. And again, you need to wait them out because you've got to have your body time to sort of readjust things chemically. After you exercise, especially if you're doing something new for the first time, you might experience muscle soreness. And that is different than muscle fatigue, because muscle fatigue, again, is due to sort of a chemical imbalance, and it's something short term. You're going to be able to get over it and have a contraction again occur fairly quickly. But muscle soreness that occurs after exercise, especially stuff that shows up after 24 hours, is due to tiny tears or micro tears in the muscle from the strenuous exercise for putting your muscles through some new. And you have a longer term discomfort. You'll feel sore for several days as your body has to do some physical repair and rebuilding of those muscle cells. So to check for understanding, can you describe how actin and myosin are arranged, those two filaments within a sarcomere, to allow for muscle contraction? Can you go through the steps in muscle contractions from that initial nerve impulse to the final muscle relaxation at the end? Can you identify the three energy pathways that provide ATP, or actually provide the energy to build ATP from ADP and P? And can you distinguish the difference between muscle fatigue and muscle soreness? If you're not sure about any of this, go back and listen to those parts of the video again.